Welcome to this presentation on Portsmouth Village, North Carolina, expanding the maritime narrative of a National Register historic district. My name is Whisnant of Duke University and formerly of East Carolina University, and I'll be introducing the beginning of this presentation, and then I'll be followed by my colleagues Kristen Baldwin, Deathridge of Appalachian State, and Lynn Harris of East Carolina University. Here's a picture of our interdisciplinary team. One of the days of one of our early visits to Portsmouth Village back in 2017 when the project began, on our way out from Ocracoke over to Portsmouth Village. The goals of this project were to really amend the documentation originally submitted to the National Register for Portsmouth Village in 1978, shortly after the village was incorporated into Cape Lookout National Seashore. That 1978 nomination, like many that were done in the early years of the National Register, was rather short, and it focused pretty heavily on the commercial history of Portsmouth and in particular on the white residents who lived at the site. It paid almost no attention to the history of slavery at the site, and it was otherwise narrow in some additional ways. So the National Park Service got funding in 2017 for a new project to expand the discussion of maritime history at the site, and particularly to give much greater attention to the documentation of the history of African American life at this particular location, where slavery was a big part of the story in the pre-Civil War years, and where the black presence on the landscape was important all the way down to the final year of the village before it was incorporated into the National Seashore. So our charge was to look at expanding these eligibility criteria under which this site was listed as significant in the National Register, to give another look to the district boundary, which was drawn for somewhat arbitrarily at the time in 1978, and also pin down the period of significance for this historic district. To do the work that we did, we required an interdisciplinary team. My expertise is North Carolina history. Kristen Deathridge's expertise is especially in historic preservation and historic architecture and the National Register process. And Lynn Harris also has expertise in historic preservation, cultural resources management, but is a maritime archaeologist by training. I only have time to give you the barest outline of the history of Portsmouth Village. Portsmouth dates back to its founding in 1753, when members of North Carolina's Colonial Assembly passed an act to charter and lay out a 50-acre town on Core Banks near Ocracoke Inlet in Carteret County. And there was going to be a fort there, and its real purpose was to help manage shipping in Ocracoke Inlet. Portsmouth's first 100 years were its real heyday. During these years, Ocracoke Inlet was the most important passage for trade and commerce through North Carolina's Outer Banks. Founded and situated to manage and support the inlet's maritime commercial activity, Portsmouth was then the most significant town on the Outer Banks. Portsmouth, Sheep Island to the south, and nearby Shell Castle in the inlet formed an interconnected maritime community together with the village of Ocracoke, which lies across Ocracoke Inlet and is now in the Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Portsmouth's fortunes were completely tied to the relative navigability of Ocracoke Inlet, with most of its people engaged in piloting, lightering, warehousing, and related activities. Its total population, white and black, increased steadily from 229 in 1790 to a high of 510 in 1860. By the 1860s, a number of changes were underway that heralded Portsmouth's growing isolation and eventual gradual decline. A powerful hurricane hit the Outer Banks in 1846 that opened Hatteras Inlet and Oregon Inlet to the north on the Outer Banks, and by the Civil War, Hatteras Inlet had supplanted Ocracoke Inlet as the most important commercial passage through the Outer Banks. And when eastern North Carolina came under Union control in 1861, Portsmouth's white and enslaved residents alike abandoned the village. The village's population never rebounded after the Civil War, and it declined in each census thereafter. And with the notable exception of one family, its black population almost completely disappeared. In the post-Civil War years, Portsmouth residents made their living in a number of maritime activities: menhaden, processing, oystering, working for the U.S. Life-Saving Service, which opened a station in 1894, or serving an emerging sport hunting and fishing industry that in the late 19th and early 20th century brought wealthy tourists to the Outer Banks. And a number of key institutions from the 19th century persisted into the 20th century, dating from that time. Throughout the 20th century, some private residences were converted to hunting and gun clubs. Waves of residents departed after storms in 1933 and 1944. The school closed, the life-saving station closed, the Methodist church closed, and Portsmouth's long decline ended with the departure of its last two white residents, two women, Marion Gray Babb and Elma Dixon, from the village after the death of the village's last black resident, Henry Piggott, in 1971, and the village was then incorporated into the Cape Lookout National Seashore. foundational set of records for understanding the population and the experiences of people living at Portsmouth is, of course, the U.S. Census. Through detailed and meticulous reevaluation of census records, we have come up with good concrete numbers on the whites and black population at Portsmouth over the years, as well as the proportion of the population that was enslaved. One thing that is important to note about the population at Portsmouth is that we have included in our figures the separately enumerated little community at Shell Castle in 1800 and 1810 that was very closely associated with Portsmouth, but is not included in the historic district for particular reasons having to do with the Park Service. But that was the years in which a local resident, John Wallace, and his collaborator, businessman John Gray Blunt, a prominent North Carolina businessman based in Washington, North Carolina, who was in a big family of land speculators, commercial entrepreneurs, and slave owners, were trying to create a commercial enterprise in Ocracoke Inlet associated with Portsmouth and associated with all of the lightering functions that the Portsmouth Village was created to serve for shipping. The little installation was called Shell Castle. It was in the inlet itself. And many enslaved people worked and lived out there on that tiny island built up with warehouses and a tavern and other facilities for ships during its heyday between 1800 and 1815 or so. So those figures, the percentage of slaves in the Portsmouth community ballooned during that period when there is this real attempt at commerce and profiting off of trade and shipping at Ocracoke. But as we can see, but even by the Civil War, right before the Civil War, we're still at over 100 enslaved people living at Portsmouth. And those numbers had at least that many people for most of the 19th century. In this slide, we're able to summarize some of the conclusions we've come to about slavery at Portsmouth based on census research as well as the research in newspapers, wills, and estate records in particular that are available for the owners of enslaved people at Portsmouth. One is that the founding Wallace family, these were some of the earliest property owners from the late 18th century at Portsmouth, and their descendants dominated early slaveholding. This included John Wallace, who was the co-developer of the Shell Castle enterprise I mentioned in the previous slide. These folks and their descendants were the holders of most of the enslaved people in the early years of Portsmouth on into the early 19th century. Enslaved people were doing a lot of heavy work, lightering, piloting, and piloting ships through the inlet, helping with all of this heavy warehousing and ship unloading and loading that was going on around Shell Castle and Portsmouth. By the 1850s and 1860s, a shift in who were the largest slave owners had occurred, and by that time, the customs collectors. These were government appointees to jobs to collect customs for the customs house that was based at Portsmouth. These were the largest slave owners by that time. Two individuals in particular who also had enslaved people that they owned over on the mainland of North Carolina. Their stories are worth more exploration, and how it is that they got to be owning all of these enslaved people and what those people were doing. A notable thing that emerges from the record is the importance of women slave owners at the site, including the original owner of what may be the oldest standing house, currently called the Washington Roberts House, but Washington Roberts did not build the house. Abigail Washburn owned the property probably when the house was built, and she was a slave owner, having inherited some enslaved people from her late husband. It's notable to see the high percentages of children and young people among the enslaved. 57% of the slaves in 1860 in the census and in the slave schedules under the age of 18. It's very clear, finally, looking at the record, that Portsmouth, like virtually every other site associated with slavery, was a site where enslaved people were bought, sold, auctioned, hired out, rented, and their families were divided as they were passed down to descendants when their white owners died and estates were split up. So there is undoubtedly are a lot of stories of anguish related to the experience of being someone who was enslaved at Portsmouth. Herald described Portsmouth in 1861. A ship going by had observed white flags flying over the village, which seemed to be deserted. But the reporter noted that contrabands, this was a term that was used for formerly enslaved people in areas that had been liberated by the Union Army. Contrabands waving white flags were abundant. So this, again, raises a tantalizing question about what the actual experience was for the formerly enslaved as the Civil War unfolded. And at the moment, we don't have firm answers to that. There are some broader trends that suggest what African Americans may have done in coastal communities. At this time, many ran towards the Union Army. Some, of course, the Union Army began recruiting black soldiers. After about 1863, there were well-known and developed refugee communities in eastern North Carolina, including at Roanoke Island. And there is definitely evidence that many enslaved people flocked to the town of Newbern, and also the nearby town of James City, developed by former enslaved people. In at least one case, we have traced an individual by name who definitely traced her roots, and her roots can be found at Portsmouth. And that was a woman named Rose Nelson, whom we found in Newbern in the 1870s, whose mother was enslaved by David Wallace Sr., so a member of that Wallace family going back to the early 1800s at Portsmouth. We have found names in the record that make it pretty clear that this connection is pretty firm. So there are tantalizing research leads that could tell us something more about the particular individuals who were enslaved and what became of them after the war. Or very small numbers of black and white residents returned to Portsmouth. Among black residents, more or less one family returned. And the descendants of that family, interestingly, remain present at Portsmouth throughout the rest of the history of the village and lead down to this one final black resident, Henry Piggott, whose death in 1971 kind of brought the very end of the village. This cemetery shows his burial in among the graves of some of the white individuals that were also resident on the village until very late. Black residents that did remain and descendants of that original family at Portsmouth undertook a number of maritime activities that are documented on the site, and we have been trying to uncover some evidence of those types of things that they did for the white residents and for white visitors. In some cases, later in the 19th century, a life-saving station was developed at Portsmouth and stationed there. Some were serving that and serving the people that worked at that station. And then later into the 20th century, we developed a kind of commercial fishing and commercial hunting, sort of tourist activity that Black residents also served. So these stories are some of the things that we've been trying to uncover in more recent years.
When it comes to architectural significance, the buildings on the island represent the period from roughly 1849 through the 1940s, and most are within the historic core of Portsmouth Village. Architectural styles and plans in the village include the shingle-style life-saving station from 1894, which is shown here at the bottom, and the story-in-a-jump house plan, which is shown here at the top. This specific one is Henry Pigot's house, and it was built around 1902. The story-in-a-jump plan is also seen across the sound at Ocracoke, and they vary but all share a few basic characteristics. They are 1.5 stories, with the half story under a side gable roof. They have 3 to 4 bays, kind of doors and windows across the front, a gable end chimney, a front porch, and they sometimes have rear L kitchens. We also have the Gothic revival details of the 1916 Methodist Church, a couple of hall parlor plan residences, including the George and Patsy Dixon House from 1887, and the American four-square plan Salter House. There are also a couple of craftsman-influenced bungalows, such as the Jessie and Lillian Babb House, which you might be able to see in the picture on the bottom, and the relatively plain post office building, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner. At the same time, most of the buildings in Portsmouth Village defy style. They do share characteristics which provide a uniform feeling. All of the buildings in the district have raised pier foundations, usually of wood, either logs or milled square pieces of lumber. Foundation piers occasionally are brick columns, but rarely for the entire building. Beneath most of the buildings, there is a shell debris field. The buildings are all wooden frame with wood siding. Sometimes the siding is board and batten, sometimes it's weatherboard, sometimes simple plank. Most have relatively low-pitched roofs, and nearly all have wooden shingle coverings. If a house does not have at least one porch, that's because a storm has destroyed it. Many have 2 porches, even the very small ones. Most of the buildings are relatively small and are residential. As is fairly typical for life in this coastal environment, buildings here were continually remodeled during their use life. Outbuildings had to be set back on their piers after flooding and storms. Smaller buildings were reconstructed altogether, and others were replaced as needed. For example, this is at least the 3rd Methodist church to stand in this location. Buildings were also moved and added onto. Several of the homes have historic cores that originally served as housing for those who staffed the life-saving station. The post office was moved to its current location in 1910. There are a wide variety of outbuildings. There are sheds, privies, boathouses, net houses, and cool houses, an example of which you see here on the left. These are very small, usually 3 feet by 3 feet, and they have open sides. Those sides were usually covered by mesh, and those are used for food storage. The majority of the houses here have multiple associated outbuildings remaining, though hurricanes damage more and more each year. These home sites were also often enclosed by fences, most of which have also been destroyed. The park maintains 1 or 2 to continue the feeling of the village. At one point in the history, there were also a few stables. The only one that's left is the one that was associated with the life-saving station. As you can see, there are no paved roads in the district, though there are clear roadbeds. Most buildings face either one of these or a waterway. The roads are perhaps the most clear and continuously used human-made feature throughout the district period of significance. The road names are based on usage rather than formal government naming, but Old Straight Road, which is the longest road in the district, was established by 1777, and two other roads were being mentioned on deeds as early as 1843. The unpaved roadways unite many of the buildings in the district, while others are linked more through waterways. The buildings in the district may have differences, but the village still feels cohesive, and the design and materials of many of the buildings do share an aesthetic. The natural and man-made elements of this coastal district are linked historically and functionally by the basis of shared maritime life. To conduct fieldwork, several App State graduate students and I joined Anne and others from the park. The students worked in teams and walked around each building as much as they could and made notes about various features. They took photos of all sides of the buildings and drew some layouts of the buildings and their associated outbuildings. If there was any park interpretive signage, they photographed that too. Then, back on campus, they reviewed all of the previously published work, park reports, and did as much deed research as they could to uncover the histories of each building. They then wrote a formal architectural description and a brief history of each property. Some of this was relatively simple and straightforward, and other times it wasn't. It was much more like putting together a puzzle. Teams from ECU and App also evaluated the cemeteries. There are burial sites all over the historic district, as each family group often buried their family members near their homesteads. There are also a few larger cemeteries which were used by everyone. The ECU students did extensive research on these, recording inscriptions for each and creating inventories. Some of this work had been done previously, they updated it, and they compared it to what they had done. As you can see, the grave sites are also impacted by time and storms in the area. That's one reason that the work has to be repeated from time to time. The sea captains' graves are some of the most interesting. These men did not live on the island, but they did pass here, and their families sent these stones from New England. For most of the year, the area is underwater, and the stones are becoming more and more unstable.
For the archaeological component, the team consulted NPS and NC state databases. At present, there are 5 known institutional repositories providing curatorial housing and stewardship of Cape Lookout's cultural materials, and these include those of Portsmouth Island. The primary holdings are located at the NPS Southeast Region Curatorial Facility in Tallahassee, Florida. Since 2002, NPS has contracted archaeological companies to conduct investigations on Portsmouth Islands. The primary companies were Southeast Archaeological Center, or SEAC, and John Milner and Associates. In 2006, the most substantive archaeological investigations were excavations in the vicinity of Dr. Samuel Dudley's house, yielding hundreds of artifacts and a very diverse assemblage. These artifacts may also represent refuse related to the structure or shack, possibly a temporary or portable housing unit, used to accommodate a group of African Americans, which according to oral testimony lived behind his, being Dr. Samuel Dudley's, house at the time. Most of the underwater surveys around the island were undertaken by a private sector commercial group known as CITCO, apart from some intensive documentation by the ECU Underwater Maritime Studies team at Stowe Castle in collaboration with the North Carolina state. A more recent 2019 project on Portsmouth Island was a small but useful non-disturbance interdisciplinary project involving faculty from the history, geography, and geology departments. The Department of Geography, Planning, and Environment deployed Leica HDS terrestrial scanners to create 3D images of the church, the life-saving station, and the Piggott House. So please click these links and you can view the 3 models. The team conducted a survey and mapped surface artifacts scattered along the entire shoreline between Hallover Point and Doctors Creek, both on land and in the shallow tidal waters. Doctors Creek was the aquatic artery that flowed towards Henry Piggott's home. He was the last remaining African-American resident on the island. And the beach area near Hallover Point, according to some of the historic maps, was also the locale of a rather short-lived and unsuccessful postbellum menhaden processing factory, known as Gray's Factory. But this was a vital part of North Carolina's fishing maritime heritage. The archaeological activities were part of our ECU Maritime Studies Field School in 2019. Here, students coordinated systematic corridor searches, either walking or snorkeling, holding onto a knotted rope, and mapped the coordinates of each cultural item that they encountered. On eroded beaches, we laid out baselines to take offset measurements to note the provenience of each artifact. As you can see in the slide, one of the challenges was the huge mosquito population that in fact is Anne Whisnant and myself, and the other in the water when snorkeling were gigantic manta rays which swam directly underneath us. Amongst the artifacts observed and documented along the eroding shoreline and in the marsh grasses was ceramics, including shell-edged pearlware dating to the late 1700s and early 1800s, eroding bricks from warehouses or homes, a variety of glassware and shards from medicine bottles and liquor bottles, and marbles, a favorite children's game in the colonial period, as well as one of the most interesting items, a Spanish coin dating to the 1700s, was very eroded, so we couldn't see the exact date. But this coin, or Spanish coins, remained legal tender in the United States until the Coinage Act of 1857. And it was the coin upon which the original United States dollar was based. It remained in legal tender in the Outer Banks, we know, in addition to Spanish dollars, as late as the early 19th century. Amongst the artifacts that featured in the underwater survey were several barrels or casks protruding out of the sediment. You could barely see the top of the staves. They were filled with marsh mud, and we did not want to disturb these in case they did have some type of important cultural material within or this buried, embedded in the sediment, but we took detailed measurements and GPS recordings and hope to investigate these items further. They've now been associated with the local taverns, the pubs, or else simply shipping activities on that shoreline. But these are some of the most interesting artifacts we observed in the Haulover Area Survey. The beach area near Haulover Point, in vicinity of the survey, according to historic maps, was a likely location for colonial and antebellum watering places or taverns, serving the local seafarers who came into the village.
This has been a very challenging project to work on for several reasons. One is that we're working in a National Register context that prioritizes ideas like integrity and the remaining built environment. Integrity is a concept that somewhat implies a permanence over time. Of course, at Portsmouth, we are working in a volatile maritime barrier island environment where shifting sands, hurricanes and storms, and increasingly inundation by rising seas is threatening the environment and has always threatened the environment and has made the built environment particularly impermanent and has brought us a series of destructions and rebuildings and adaptations and movings of features across the environment over time. It's a volatile environment where change is the main constant. So this doesn't fit too well when you're trying to work with concepts that really emphasize permanence over time. Secondly, a challenge has been that most of the built environment that remains now at Portsmouth dates from a period later than the village's heyday. Most of it dates from the late 19th century into the 20th. Of course, these were not the periods when Portsmouth was at its height as an important village for shipping through Ocracoke Inlet in North Carolina. So we have to make our arguments in other ways, focusing on the overall landscape, certain consistent uses over time, road networks, and structures that may have post-dated others but continue similar uses of the property. Then finally, trying to uncover and highlight African American history at a site like this is especially challenging. The built environment that remains, again, is not consistent with the period of time when the greatest African American populations, enslaved populations mostly, were living at the site. It postdates the site, so most of the built structures now are associated with white residents of the village. Additionally, trying to uncover the specific histories of Black individuals through the historical and archaeological record is very challenging. In the historical record, obviously, those sources are becoming more and more revealing as more sources become available. But in terms of the archaeological record, there has not been full investigation of really documentable and known possible archaeological locations having to do with where enslaved people may have lived and worked, because partly the access to the site is so difficult. So there's a lot to be done here, and the next steps will be after we get our document submitted and approved by the Keeper of the National Register, we'll really turn over to the National Park Service to continue to find ways to tell the stories of Portsmouth, even when the actual landscape over time, the built environment, the remnants of the village may find themselves overtaken by the changes continuing and accelerating in the natural environment.